Okay, I'm Dr. Rob Graf, and I'm the winter wheat breeder here at the Lethbridge Research and Development Centre of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. I'm one of two winter wheat breeders in Western Canada. I tend to concentrate on the class Canada Western Red Winter, which is a milling and baking type. The other winter wheat breeding program, which is out of the University of Manitoba, is somewhat of a smaller program that tends to develop feed type varieties. So, how many of you grow winter wheat? Okay, there's a few of you. How many of you want to grow winter wheat? Oh, come on. Well, I was in one of the vans earlier today, and it was said that winter wheat is kind of like a disease, and once you catch it, it's hard to shake. And I have to admit that I'm very much the same way. I used to be a spring wheat breeder, and 19 years ago, when I came to Lethbridge, I started breeding winter wheat. Hard to believe it's that long, and in my opinion, I could never go back to breeding spring wheat. Spring wheat is just a wimpy little plant. Winter wheat is where it's at. So there's one plug. So when I signed up to be part of this plot hop today, I was hoping that we would start seeing a lot of diseases out here. And the season being as it is, we're seeing almost nothing. I was hoping we would see some stripe rust. I haven't seen any at this point. I'm still hoping we will see some. I'll explain why in a few minutes. The odd line, we're seeing a little bit of tan spot right now, but again, not very much. And as you can see, we're getting close to heading. We've actually got some experimental lines on dry land, as well as here on irrigation, where we are already seeing some heading. From the standpoint of the breeding program, this area here is under irrigation. It's among the most precious material I have. It's all early generation material. There's one copy of this, period. Okay, so if the big white combine was to come through, we have some processes in place that we could recover, but it wouldn't be instantaneous. It would take us a year or two. So what have we got here? At this site, we've got about 16,000 individual single rows, and about I wrote it down, 1,300 preliminary lines. These preliminary lines are in yield trials, and it's the first time that we evaluate the lines for yield. From there, that 1,300, based on various disease nurseries, and Reem showed you her nurseries for stripe rust and bunt. Based on that data, based on stem and leaf rust data, as well as fusarium data, I'll get rid of a lot of lines. Same thing based on yield, based on lodging, height, and so on. Winter hardiness is also one that we take a good look at. And so from that 1,300, I'll bring it down to probably 120 or less. So we get rid of about 90%. From there, and those lines will then go to replicated trials at 5 sites across Western Canada. Out of that 120, I'll bring it down to about 30 to 40 lines. Those get seeded again across Western Canada and replicated trials at 9 sites. And so based on, and we do all the disease data, we do quality evaluation and so on all the way along once we're into these yield trials. Based on that, I'll whittle it down, and we'll have somewhere between 5 to 8 lines that'll go into registration trials for 3 years, and the culling will continue to the end, where hopefully at the end of all that, we may have a variety to register. So that's the process. And with winter wheat, it takes about 10 to 12 years. And then there's another 3 years for multiplication. So you're talking in that 12 to 15 year time range. Is this any different than spring wheat breeding? Not really. The big difference is we seed in the fall, and so we've got a crazy fall period where we harvest and then have to turn everything around and seed again, which to some extent limits the size of the program. And the other thing that we can't do is we can't send our lines to a winter nursery like New Zealand or Chile, like spring crop people do, because we've got that vernalization requirement. We need that cold period in order to get the plants to go reproductive. So it's one generation per year. It's just the nature of the beast. We can do some things in the greenhouse. I tend to shy away from that to advance generations quickly, because I feel getting the lines out into the environment where they're going to have to grow is a real advantage, particularly when you're looking at the adaptation for winter hardiness. You want that stress on the plant. They're not going to get it in the greenhouse. And so that's one of the reasons we tend to shy away from that. The process tends to be, after we make the cross in growth rooms, we grow it out, and the F2s are grown in Lethbridge. And I pick roughly, I don't know, 16, 17,000 heads. Each one of those heads is threshed individually and planted out as a row. And then based on the environment, whatever diseases we have and so on, I pick heads out of rows that I like, that have good straw strength, the right plant type, and so on. Those heads get threshed again in bulk by cross, and they get sent to Saskatoon. Now, why would I do that? The reason is Saskatoon is a much harsher environment, and what we're trying to do is kill off those lines, those plants that don't have the winter hardiness, okay? And so we select those that survive well, again, looking at diseases, plant type, straw strength, and all that kind of thing. From there, all of those lines get sent to Winnipeg, and we do rating on stem and leaf rust. After that, they come back here as rows. We'll rate for stripe rust and so on, and we harvest rows, and they become our preliminary trials. So we're talking about 6-7 years there. So that's the whole story. Yep.
Are the Chinooks not harder on the plant than steady cold?
It depends. Chinooks can be very hard. You're absolutely right. But the plants do have a lower limit to which they can acclimate. And certainly what we saw this past year in parts of Manitoba and eastern Saskatchewan, winter wheat got put in on time, but they had very little, if any, snow cover. And we lost some sites because of it. If you look across this site here today, you'll notice there's a bit of a bare patch down over there. These are actually our seed increase plots. That is not winter kill. That's flooding damage. Something that we rarely see here, but there was flooding this year, and that really bothers me, because it's something that, well, unfortunately we couldn't avoid it, but it's something we rarely see, and I'm going to have to try to come up with a way of recovering those lines. They're not totally lost, it's just we might lose a bit of time. From the standpoint of the winter wheat breeding program, I kind of alluded to it. I tend to divide my objectives up in 3 areas: agronomics, disease, and quality. Of course, agronomics is very, pretty straightforward. We want high yield, we want good straw strength, good winter hardiness, something not too tall, although if I could develop a relatively tall variety with extremely good straw, I think there would be some people very interested in it. Good test weight. We tend to select for larger kernels as well, because the idea is that those kernels will have more endosperm, more energy to get the plant going in the fall when it needs it. One of the areas, or 2 areas, that we've really ramped up efforts in this program are disease resistance and quality. Recognizing that in winter wheat, until 20 years ago, there was no registered variety that had any disease resistance whatsoever. So we've come a long way. We've got lines with pretty much the full gamut of resistance to all 3 rusts, to fusarium head blight, to bunt, and even wheat curl mite resistance and Russian wheat aphid resistance. So we've come a long way, and we continue those efforts because as I see it, the resistance that we've got tends to be, as I would refer to it, pretty shallow. We've got one effective gene in each variety that is effective. But what we want to do is put 2 or 3 genes together so that we've got good durable resistance. And Reem was talking about some of the efforts in stripe rust where we're trying to combine both adult plant and all stage resistance. The adult plant resistance, if we can combine 2 or 3 genes, it tends to be very durable. It doesn't break down. One gene tends to be not effective enough, so we need several. In winter wheat, we also need, at least in my thinking, all stage resistance as well, because we see early infection in the spring and we want to have those plants resistant as well. And for any of you who have experience with varieties like Moats or Emerson, if you've seen stripe rust early on in the spring, that is exactly the case with that type of resistance because it's an adult plant type of resistance. It's not all stage. So we're working on incorporating both types of resistance into our lines. And that's not just for stripe rust, it's for leaf rust and it's for stem rust as well. We're looking at putting more genes into our lines as well for fusarium head blight. And I would say at this point, we're a little bit behind on bunt. We do have some good bunt resistant lines, but we have to play a little bit of catch up on that yet. And there'll be more lines coming. So that's the disease side. From the quality side, one of the things that is often talked about is that winter wheat doesn't have as good quality as spring wheat. And I get a little bit testy at that point because our winter wheat, our Canada Western Red Winter, is actually better quality than what they produce in the US. And so I think, as Western Canada, we need to capitalize on that because there's certainly a lot of market for US hard red winter.
So you're comparing winter wheat on both sides?
Yes.
And winter wheat to their spring wheat?
No, our winter wheat to their winter wheat. And our winter wheat is of better quality.
Well, the problem is a farmer is getting that back on your paycheck.
Well, and I think there's a lot of reasons why that is. I think part of the problem is grain companies have to bin it separately, and winter wheat is spread right across Western Canada, and it costs the grain companies money to bin it separately. And I think, in my opinion, I think there needs to be a little bit of a rethink on how we classify our medium quality wheats. That's simply my opinion. So what are we doing to combat this? Well, about 15 years ago, it was said what we need to do in quality is increase protein concentration, increase gluten strength, and Farina Graf water absorption. Now, what is Farina Graf water absorption? What that is, in simple terms, is when you make flour from a certain variety or a certain class of wheat, it will absorb a certain amount of water. And so the baker, based on a certain amount of flour, will get X amount of dough. So if you can pack more water into that dough or into that flour, you get more dough. And that's what the difference is. Winter wheat actually absorbs less water. Now, in some ways, for the farmer, that's a good thing because in order to get a certain number of loaves of bread, you actually need to use more wheat. But wheat is still more expensive than water. So the bakers want to put in as much water as they can. So our winter wheats, not compared to US winter wheats, I mean, they're much the same, but compared to Canada Western Red Spring or Hard Red Springs, they certainly are at a disadvantage from a water absorption standpoint. So we're working on that. That's been the most difficult. We've fixed the gluten strength issue. Certainly our protein concentrations are coming up. Some of our newer varieties definitely have more protein. Things like Emerson, like Gateway, Flourish was another one, have that. But just like with spring wheat, there is that trade-off. You know, when you increase protein concentration, you do tend to decrease yield. So you've got to have that balance. We do have some new lines, some parental lines that we've developed that look like it helps to stretch that relationship. And we now have some experimental lines we're using as parents that takes our protein concentration up over 14%, when our regular winter wheats like a Radiant would be at about 11.2 to 11.5. So we have the germplasm. We've also got some nice increases in water absorption, taking it within a stone's throw of our CWRS. And I can show you a line that's kind of a prototype right now that's in registration trials. So we're working on it. It takes time, but we're going to get there.
Will you give up any yield to get that protein in the winter wheat, or?
Probably yes, but the idea is that as much as we can, we're going to have yield levels at least where wildfire is eventually. We're trying to put these genes into wildfire type background and so on. We don't want to go backwards in yield. I'm not going to let that happen. If it yields less, it'll be gone or recycled as a parent, that kind of thing. So I'll talk a little bit about varieties, some of the things that are coming up. And this variety right behind me here is Elevate, and we registered this variety back in 2014, and it became available last fall. This variety was an attempt to get one that fit right across Western Canada, and we almost got there. It's got resistance to all three rusts, or had resistance to all three rusts, intermediate resistance to fusarium, moderate resistance to bunt, and wheat curl mite resistance. Unfortunately, since registration, there seems to have been a minor shift in races, and Reem might be able to tell us more about that, where this line, having been moderately resistant to intermediate, is now moderately susceptible to susceptible. The rest of the characteristics are solid. This line yields about 6 to 7% more than Radiant. It's shorter, it's stronger strawed, and it's got good winter hardiness. One other thing that we're starting to see, and this takes time to get a handle on, but over the past 3 years, we've got a site, well, we've had a long-term site at Warner with Brian Otto. And what was very interesting is in trials where Elevate and Wildfire were side by side, and I'll talk about Wildfire in a minute, at most sites, Wildfire would beat it. But in Warner, Elevate, despite the fact Wildfire looked better, Elevate would out-yield it. And then last year, of course, it was very dry, and all of our southern Alberta sites, Elevate was higher yielding. So it seems to have much better drought tolerance than our other varieties. Not to say that Wildfire doesn't have some drought tolerance, because it does relative to some other varieties, but Elevate tends to shine under drought. And when you look at the yield curves across southern Alberta at different yield levels, it's certainly showing that below about that 60 bushel per acre range environment, Elevate is better, and then Wildfire takes off.
It's also a shorter season, right?
Than Wildfire? Yes. Elevate would be a couple of days earlier than Radiant. Okay, for those of you who have grown Radiant, and it's been the mainstay out here for a long, long time.
That's because it's launching maturity, so it means about a week when it comes to combine.
Further north, Here in southern Alberta, no.
Those people involved with barley also would like that.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, wildfire. Or, where's wildfire? This is wildfire. That was elevate. No, wait a minute. I'm confused. Looking at this. Elevate, wildfire. Here we go. So, wildfire, in my opinion, is a real breakthrough in terms of yield. Sorry? 5 minutes? Okay, perfect. It's yielding 14 to 17% more than Radiant. And that's a huge jump in yield. It is a day or two later than Radiant, but with winter wheat, you know, maybe up north, some people would be concerned, particularly if they're trying to get it off at the same time as barley. Some people aren't concerned about that. You know, but we do have a range of varieties that have differences in maturity. But at this point, this is the highest yielding variety. It's got good straw strength, not quite as good as something like a Radiant or a Gateway, but it's certainly, you know, compared to the old winter wheats, there's no comparison. From a disease standpoint, resistant to stripe rust. We don't completely understand what genes are involved, but we think there's at least 3 or 4 minor genes involved in this resistance. It's moderately resistant to bunt, and something you might be very interested in is also moderately resistant to Fusarium head blight. So 3 varieties, 3 disease resistance types for Alberta that really cover the gamut. And so it should be a really good Western Prairie variety. I don't recommend it for the Eastern Prairies. It does well there, but it doesn't have stem rust resistance, so that's a downfall. Couple final things I'll say. You might remember, for those of you who are old enough, back in the late 80s, Russian wheat aphid was a huge concern. And my predecessor and various other scientists here started a program to incorporate Russian wheat aphid resistance into winter wheat. The reason it was in winter wheat was because they would tend to follow the Rocky Mountains as the crop ripened, and by the time they got here, you would have nice fresh seedlings of winter wheat in the field, and they would attack it and reduce the survivability. Russian wheat aphid really didn't become the problem that we thought it might. But we continued on with the breeding efforts, and wildfire actually has resistance to the Russian wheat aphid as well.
By resistance, what do you mean by resistance? The aphid, right?
No.
Hairiness or what?
No. It's some kind of physiological mechanism. It's not well understood.
Doesn't taste good, or?
That would seem to be the case, but I haven't seen any research that really can pin down what it is at this point. So there's that. The other final thing I'd say is, for those of you on Twitter, if you follow me, you might have noticed that there was some discussion over the past few days about winter wheat for silage. And if you look at wildfire, it is extremely leafy. And so while I don't have data for silage yields, I would say it may make a very good silage variety. The other thing is, because it is this leafy and tends to stay prostrate in the spring, it tends to cover the soil very quickly, and you get better weed suppression. Okay, so that's that one. Make a couple quick comments about the next 2. Gold Rush is a new one that we put out in 2016. It's an all right variety for Alberta. I would say, you know, Elevate and Wildfire are the ones you'd want to go with. This one seems to be particularly well adapted for Saskatchewan. And, you know, it's a completely different genetic background than what Elevate and Wildfire have. And for whatever reason, it does better in Saskatchewan. It's kind of the whole idea. Buteo never took off in Alberta because it was at a yield disadvantage to Radiant. And yet, there was this genotype environment interaction. This line tends to be more closely related to Buteo, which did really well in Saskatchewan. I think is still the second most popular variety there. Okay, this is the last one. This is something brand new, and it's it's actually part of the Canada Western experimental class, and this is a hard white winter. It's the first of its kind in Western Canada, and we're working with FP Genetics and Siggy to try to get some interest in the marketplace for this type of variety. Now, what are we looking for? Well, one of the things about Canada Western Red Winter is that it milds better than any other class out there, including the Springs. This builds on that, has a white seed, and tends to have a little bit lower protein, but very good gluten strength, which is exactly what they want for Asian steamed buns. It also is exceptionally good for noodles. So we're hoping that there'll be some markets for that. Water absorption might be an issue, just like it is on the other winters. We're working on correcting that as well. But this is something brand new, so if you hear about Icefield, the ice referring to something white, that's what this variety is all about. Good rust package, similar to Moats and Emerson. Fusarium is intermediate, and it is susceptible to bunt, so seed treatment would be required. But that's the story on those varieties.
Rob, is it very much higher yielding, the white wheat, than the reds? Or?
No. I would say this particular line would be in the pack of the red winters. Yeah. Now, what you might be thinking is the soft white winters, which tend to have much lower protein, much higher yields. We're working on them. We're not there yet. The biggest problem with that is anywhere in the world that they grow soft white winters, winter hardiness doesn't tend to be a problem. And so to get that kind of quality package into lines that have the winter hardiness is difficult, because we have to be crossing to hard reds that have good hardiness. To bring back the quality, which is completely different, is a challenge. And if you're ever interested, Gary, I'll show you some of the experimentals that I've got. We're getting there.
All right. Well, if you can all join me in thanking Rob very much for his time. And Rob will be around